The Across the Aisle podcast is brought to you by the University of Canberra to provide informed bipartisan commentary on the 2025 Australian federal election across the aisle. It brings insights and observations from two political veterans from different sides of Australian politics, as well as from their invited guests. David Feeney and University of Canberra adjunct Professor Scott Ryan both got involved in politics at university for the Labor Party and Liberal Party respectively. Scott went on to work for the Institute for Public Affairs and pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline and was elected to the Australian Senate in 2007. He held various positions in the Abbott and Turnbull ministries and was president of the Senate for 4 years until in 2021 he was appointed Australia's High Commissioner to Canada. In 2024, Scott and his family returned to Australia and settled in Canberra. David Feeney has held multiple positions in the ALP, including as a campaign director, and was elected to the Australian Senate in 2007. He served as Parliamentary Secretary for Defence in the Gillard and Second Rudd ministries. In 2013, David moved to the House of Representatives, winning the Victorian seat of Batman. He left politics in 2018 when found to be a dual citizen by the High Court. Since then, David has worked in the defence and strategic policy sector based in Melbourne, where he lives with his family. Now let's join David and Scott's conversation across the aisle.
Welcome back to Across the Aisle. I'm David Feeney.
And I'm Scott Ryan.
And we have the last week of the campaign to talk about, Scott, which of course, you might say, launched itself with the leaders' debate on the 15th of April. A debate held on the ABC, which attracted something in the order of 1 million viewers, 1.7 million viewers across all of their platforms. And while this was enough to win the ABC the time slot, and was a significant crowd, about 750,000 viewers stayed on the channel to watch the Insider's special debate analysis. It still represents a lot fewer people than, for instance, watched the 2010 debate between Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard. That was at 3.4 million. So fewer people were watching it. The general perspective of pundits seemed to be that it was a draw. And there was a bit of a feeling that because it was a draw and there was an urgent need for Dutton to secure some momentum in his campaign, the draw meant a strategic win for Albo. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think when you come to these debates, particularly when you've got a relatively young government, like you do with the current Labor government, there's always the burden upon the opposition to establish the reason for change. And so to a certain extent, I would agree with that, regardless of the context. The opposition needs to both give people comfort and give people hope, as some of our pollsters would say. That said, I'm not entirely convinced the debates have the same impact. I mean, they drive the media coverage, but a media that is less absorbed by a great deal of the public. You know, the decline in the number of viewers of that debate represents a similar decline in the number of people watching the 6 and 7 p.m. news on our major channels every night. And to a certain extent, I think it's also the people that watch it. It's a bit like Fox Footy for fans of politics, which is what Insiders or Sky can be. People who enjoy talking, reading, watching about politics. I'm not sure they're the voters that are really undecided or the voters who really swing elections.
But you do end up, don't you, with a whole lot of little clips.
Indeed.
Which populate YouTube and so forth, Twitter, X. And these little clips try and show the highlights or lowlights of the debate.
Indeed. And that's where you arguably might even get some higher viewership, and you'd probably get higher viewership amongst the groups both parties are targeting, both in a positive sense about their plan and a negative sense about their opposition.
But the thing that makes debates consequential is when there's a spectacular mistake or a spectacular blow landed by one upon the other. Joe Biden, you might say, is the patron saint of consequential debates. There were a few blows landed here. The one that seemed to get a bit of attention was Dutton accusing the Prime Minister of being loose with the truth around negative gearing and the modelling of that. Do you think that mattered?
Again, I think when it comes to the debate and its coverage, it's the issue that matters. You know, so what happened there is the Prime Minister used a different set of words than the Treasurer did the following day, and a different set of words that he did a year ago. And I think Jim Chalmers' defence was, yes, we had some modelling done, but we didn't commission it. Now, I'm not sure how that passes as a defence, but I do think what the Labor Party wouldn't like is the issue of negative gearing rearing its head, because it's gone to so much trouble, particularly after the 2019 election. It's gone to so much trouble to put it to bed, to not have it raised, to say there won't be any plans or any intentions to touch it. So again, I look at it through, does it drive coverage of an issue in the media that one side wants or doesn't want? And the next day, there was more debate about negative gearing than I think the Labor Party wanted. They've wanted the campaign focused on Medicare.
Yeah, I agree with that. Then, of course, there's the issue about whether self-harm was committed by Dutton on this Russian base in Indonesia. I've got to say this one mystifies me a little bit, because Dutton, of course, put some words into the Indonesian president's mouth concerning the Russian airbase in Indonesia. In the debate itself, Dutton apologised for making those remarks. He said he misspoke. Labor, of course, leapt onto it. But I guess what puzzles me about this one is a few things. Firstly, why did Dutton clean up his mistake in a televised debate rather than somewhere else at some time else? The other thing that confuses me about this one is it was obviously a mistake that was dangerous for Dutton, because once again, it was a foreign affairs and security mistake, and they're supposed to be his strengths. They're supposed to be things that make him a reassuring candidate for high office rather than a reckless candidate for high office. But then in recent days, we've seen the coalition kind of hang on to this issue rather than jettison it into the rearview mirror. And that has surprised me. I thought it was a bad moment for the coalition, and it's the coalition that's not letting it go.
Well, I think if you're going to make a mistake, it's better to own it. And Peter did that.
Or make a big one.
Well, Peter did that also with the work from home issue a couple of weeks ago. And, I think I said last week, people often criticise politicians for not owning up to mistakes. Ideally, it wouldn't have happened. But I will say I do think Labor has used it to cloud the issue a little. And the issue is, we've had Murray Watt on the ABC on the weekend use a different set of words than the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, or the Prime Minister. And there's a conflation between, was there a request for a base or was there a request to base a plane? They're two very different things. And so I can see why the opposition is pressing the issue. I had a look at the caretaker conventions over the weekend as this issue was going, and they generally require briefings to opposition when decisions are needed to be made. That's the broadest way to describe them. Mm-hmm. And so whether or not that's the case here, what I'd say is, reflecting on my time overseas, I do think one of the good things about Australian politics is we can argue about the level of defence spending, but we broadly agree, I think, on the state of where the world is and the place Australia finds itself in and the risks we face, both security-wise and economically. And I wouldn't want to see that break down. So here I think you would call it a draw, because I don't think the government has done particularly well also using a different set of words to describe it. And what Murray Watt did on the weekend actually kicked it off for another couple of days.
Yeah, well, as I say, I'm surprised the opposition haven't let it go. But, caretaker provisions, as you say, require consultation with the opposition when a policy response is required. The fact that Russia and Indonesia are not doing anything in Indonesia doesn't require a policy response. I think the opposition are trying to make something of the fact that they haven't been afforded a briefing, but I can tell you, when I was a shadow defence spokesperson, if I had $1 for every briefing I was refused, I'd have a few more dollars. So the government of the day is not as generous with these things as they might make out.
That's also true, though. I imagine that you can reverse the trade, so to speak, that you probably were wishing you had more briefings and said so publicly. I think it would be unfortunate if anything about this request was revealed after the election that was known beforehand. I don't think that would be good, I think, for the state of defence policy and security policy in Australia.
So that was kind of one of the key moments of the debate. Overall, my impression was Albo was well prepared, he was clear, and the sort of both contestants retired from the battle intact without having launched a KO on one another. Was that your impression?
Yeah, and I think he has been a former campaign director, I've been a staffer. You do tend to be happy when the principal comes out of those things without being wounded, it's as much a relief. These are risks rather than opportunities in many ways. But I do think it's fair to say that the Prime Minister has been on his game much better than the 2022 campaign. We wouldn't be the only people to observe the rise in his confidence. I do think it's fair to say that, Peter Dutton had a rough week before that, and particularly before the campaign launched, that was a few days earlier. And I do think he probably did well to make sure it was a draw, and particularly given some of these matters do involve international affairs, oppositions are always at a bit of a disadvantage there because of the lack of information they have access to in relative terms. And so I think, like you said, it was a draw, and I think both sides would be relatively happy with that.
I thought it was a little awkward there at one moment in the debate when Dutton seemed to draw attention to the fact that he didn't know Trump personally, he didn't know the Indonesian president personally. Albo did. So I think there were some awkward moments there for Dutton, but as we touched upon, there was for Albo too. The debates will resume, Scott. We will not miss out on more of these. 22nd of April, Channel 9 will host the debate that it's billing The Great Debate. And on the 27th of April, Channel 7 is hosting what it's billing as The Final Showdown.
And I can't remember a campaign where there were effectively 4 debates.
I agree.
If you include the Sky. I mean, normally there's a couple.
Yeah.
But it just sort of reflects that going into this campaign, and still all the way through it, and we can talk about the polls a bit later, it's still effectively close, and both sides don't want to leave anything sort of on the field, so to speak. I mean, the Prime Minister was reported as having told his colleagues, never forget 2019. Anything can happen in the last couple of weeks. And so, I do think both sides are saying we're going to take advantage of every opportunity to pitch our case, but also, let's be blunt, define the alternative in the way we want it defined. So Anthony Albanese, it's not just about his plans. He wants to define Peter Dutton a certain way. And Peter Dutton is the exact reverse of that. But that's modern campaigning. It's a binary choice.
Yeah. But I think you make a really good point. I've been involved in campaigns where we felt we were in the ascendancy, and that's when we wanted as few debates as possible. We'd agree to one, and we'd agree to one early on in the campaign so that the risk was mitigated. When you're coming from behind, you want 25 debates.
Yep, daily.
Yeah. And so what's really interesting here is that both sides, as you say, have agreed to this big number. And we're not even talking about the various shadow ministers that have had debates too.
Yeah, true.
Which really does speak to the fact that both sides came into this campaign thinking it was super close and they needed to put everything on the table.
And I think to refer to one of our earlier conversations, David, we've got a situation where both parties' primary votes are much lower than they have been over the last 30 or 40 years and trending downwards, and that creates much more volatility. Preference flows, a few points here or there can make a difference, as they always have in a couple of seats. But when your primary vote is so much lower, I think both parties are trying to take advantage of every opportunity to engage with as many people as possible, even if the viewers on Channel 9 and Channel 7 might get a different crowd than the ABC did, but truth is that they're probably not going to be the great bulk of late deciding voters. Although the media coverage of what happens, if someone makes a mistake, if someone lands a knockout blow, if an external event intervenes from our, friends over the Pacific, that could actually be quite defining, as people are making decisions to go into the polling booth. And of course, today is the first day of pre-poll voting, so it will be very interesting to see what the queues are like. In Canada, on their first day of pre-poll voting, they had 2 million people vote, which is essentially about 10% of people voting on day one. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here today and over the next couple of days as voting opens.
It sure will.
If you're as invested in politics as we are on Across the Aisle, consider studying a degree in politics and international relations from the University of Canberra and learn in the heart of Australia's government. Fuel your passion for politics, connect with decision makers, and gain the insights that shape real-world policy. Find out more at canberra.edu.au.
So it seems like at the end of, by the conclusion of last week, the beginning of this week, both sides have got all of their major policy announcements out the door. The coalition has still got a defence announcement to come, which it's kind of been frilling up. So it sounds like it'll be a significant announcement. Do you think that defence announcement is going to be a consequential one?
Well, it's been flagged as such, and I would honestly probably expect it before Thursday of next week, as in the 1st of May. I read this morning that seems to be the day that both sides will be releasing their sort of financial costings of all their policies and their tabulation of spending and saving. So I would expect it sometime before that. And given the profile given to it by the opposition, and as you mentioned, Peter Dutton's own background, and the coalition's criticism of Labor over the last couple of years, you would expect it to be a significant policy.
I'll be watching it with great interest because, as you know, defence policy is my thing, but I can really see why Dutton would want to switch the channel to defence and security issues as the campaign enters the final straight. So that will be interesting. But on the other major policies, energy policy, housing policy seem to have been two key battlefields. And I have to admit, Scott, because I'm a sadist, I watched the shadow energy spokesperson debate Labor's energy minister, and it was hard going. There were a lot of petajoules.
Yeah.
There was a lot of jargon, a lot of acronyms. I'm vaguely interested in politics, and I found it, a challenging debate between the two of them. But I thought it was an interesting debate, the sort of folksy style of one versus the sort of aggressive style of the other. But I left it thinking that in the energy domain, and I think this is probably true to some extent in the housing policy area too, there is a parity of confusions. And that failure of the policy detail to be understood and dissected for sufficiently long has led to the view that Dutton left it too late to launch these policies if he wanted to penetrate the mind of the electorate and get his policies talked about. Do you think there's anything in that?
I do think there's a real challenge around the complexity of these policy areas. Just to start with energy, I remember, sitting in the ministry and dealing with this in government. These are incredibly complex policy solutions and challenges. And what people want is affordable power and the lights to work.
Yes.
But what goes on beyond that is very complex. And I do think in that sense you do have, and the polls have shown this, a third of the people who want just renewables and a third of the people who support sort of nuclear replacing coal, I suppose, is the best way to do it as a provider of significant dispatchable baseload power. And that reflects, I would say, a bit of political tribalism. And then you have probably more than I expected in the middle, with open minds or without strong opinions either way. But I'm not entirely sure on how they get persuaded given the complexity of the debate. I watched a good part of that as well, and it is hard going. I mean, there definitely weren't, late deciding voters watching that at the press club in an afternoon. And when it comes to housing, you've probably got more interested groups seeking to understand it. Like, what does this mean for my children trying to buy a house or for me trying to buy my first home? But I do get a little concerned at the complexity actually misconveying some of the policy. So, for example, are people going to misunderstand Labor's policy on 5% deposits and the gap being covered so you don't need lenders' mortgage insurance as, the government will cover some of the deposit? I remember when I bought my first home many years ago, I didn't even know what lenders' mortgage insurance was till I started going through the mortgage process. And so there's a whole degree of complexity that I think a very small group of people understand there. And it'll be interesting to see how those competing policies on housing persuade, because as we observed last week, we had a convergence of the campaign on those issues, which is different when you often have parties trying to campaign on different issues.
Yes, both sides were very keen to be seen to be increasing housing supply and supporting Australians trying to get a house. But economists described both policies really as a bin fire of bad ideas and raised concerns about the cost and the failure for it to affect the supply side of the housing debate. Do you think that concern by conservatives and economists about the fiscal impact of this policy and indeed all the policies was part of the reason for Dutton to flag the indexation of income tax brackets with the Australian? That, as you know, would be, he's only described it as an aspiration, so Dutton hasn't committed a coalition government to it, but still it would be a big move.
And, it was tried for a couple of years in the late 1970s and then axed.
Axed by John Howard, I think.
Under strict orders from Malcolm Fraser, I think. I've always been a fan of the policy precisely because it limits the capacity for sort of new initiatives without there being a corresponding discussion about how they're paid for. But I do think that did reflect, some of the commentary, but also the sentiment of a lot of people you have in the coalition and concern about where the budget is balanced. I mean, what I've found extraordinary over the first 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign, David, is that we've got an international trading order being upended, an international security order or a period of challenge being significantly stepped up. And, we are one of the most trade exposed countries of the larger countries in the world that's not part of a serious trade bloc like the EU. We have trade agreements, of course. Yet the issues that we were focusing on, I thought, were a bit ancillary to the challenges Australia might face, whether that be work from home, or issues like that. The critique of housing policy came twofold, one on the fiscal impact and one on supply needs to increase to address housing. But of course, the opposition also raised the issue of immigration and how demand there can be addressed. And I did think that was a bit undercovered in the end. I wasn't sure why. It's been a focus of the opposition for a while, but it didn't seem to get the same focus as part of their overall housing strategy that I thought it might.
I agree. I thought they were potentially rich policy fields for the coalition, and I wonder if they backed off them because it just looked a bit Trumpy at a moment in time when looking Trumpy is not in fashion this season. But listen, I'm guessing. I'm surprised.
No, that there is a real sensitivity, for people on the centre-right of politics at the moment, I think, and a legitimate one. I mean, Donald Trump won an election in America, not by a lot. He won it, and he won a majority, but it wasn't a landslide. But in other parts of the world, he's not as popular, including amongst supporters of the centre-right. So it doesn't help the centre-right. I don't think anyone would contend that the election of Donald Trump and the policies he's announced since January 20 have done anything other than hinder the centre-right in Australia and comparable countries everywhere in the world.
Yes, I agree. I think for a time he gave the centre-right a boost, but once someone gave him an atlas and he looked at it and said, "Oh, what's this Greenland business?" and started talking Canada, Panama and tariffs, things went off the rails in terms of the attractiveness of his cause for Conservatives.
Look, it was never attractive to a good bunch,
Sure.
and a lot of people would say, including in the US, that it's not very conservative. But you win an election, you win an election. I'm not going to criticise that. I'd criticise people for not accepting the result of an election maybe a few years earlier. The tariff stuff's not surprising. I mean, everything they're doing there, they said they would do, and that shouldn't be a surprise. But anyone that's not surprised by Greenland and the 51st state campaign on Canada, I don't know what they were taking before the election, because that caught everyone by surprise.
You're listening to Across the Aisle, recorded right here at UCFM, the University of Canberra's own radio station. Study a Bachelor of Communication and Media at UC and get real-world experience while you learn. Find out more at canberra.edu.au. So, to finish the tale of the week that was, I left the week feeling like the Teals were doing better than I had expected they would be doing. And I wondered if that was because they're getting a lot of generous coverage or a lot of coverage all up, really. You'll remember my theory was Teals were elected on the trifecta of policy about women, policy about climate change, antipathy to Morrison. And I wondered how, in the absence of those things being front-running issues, the Teals would perform. To my surprise, it seems like they're in the hunt again. And indeed, perhaps expanding, if you think Bradfield's under threat or whatever. How do you feel Planet Teal's going?
Well, I think I share your view, David, that Planet Teal gets a pretty good run from the media. I think they get a disproportionate run, given that they are really, a couple of them, really just one electorate in some of our major cities. That's not to deny that their impact and what happened last time is important, I think, historically as well. I'll be honest, I do think that the same people that talk about the threat of big money in politics don't seem to talk about that in the same way with respect to Climate 200, which is really like an American super PAC for those that understand American politics in many, many ways.
And a very prominent gambler gave the Greens $500,000. But that, of course, is different when they give to the Greens.
But I also think there's a difference between fundraising for groups that then hand out money on non-transparent bases, because it's not required to, I should say. It's just required to disclose. It's not breaking any rules. and political parties. Just as there's a difference between political parties that have to seek the trade-offs that government involves versus those that seek to simply barter or be on the crossbench and make demands. So I think it will be interesting. A lot of the Teals had very narrow victories. I do think there are, and we can go through a couple of seats later on. I know in Melbourne people are optimistic, but it will be interesting to see in Victoria in particular how much the primary vote comes back from essentially an historic low that helped the Teals get over the line, and in some cases get over the line and make the difference between victory and otherwise, and the impact of Teals in other states where there wasn't the same collapse in the Liberal primary vote as we saw in Melbourne at the last election.
Okay, let's turn to the polls. There have been some interesting polls over the last week. For my taste, Scott, I don't know how you feel about this, but I've always felt like the most reliable poll, the one I've personally relied on the most over the years, has always been Newspoll.
Yep.
So there's a free ad for Newspoll. And their most recent Newspoll was taken between the 14th and 17th of April, and it showed an unchanged two-party preferred position of 52-48 in favour of the government, with an ALP primary vote now up to 34. And you'll remember in recent times it's reached the high 20s. So we live in an era where 34 sounds pretty good to me.
And at the same time, I think, the coalition primary vote has dropped, as recorded by Newspoll. It got to the high 30s and then has dropped now down to 35. So I think I generally look at the primary votes only because when you've got such low primary votes, preference allocation in polls is much more difficult. And, 52.4 is quite different to 51.6, and the rounding and the way they're reported as whole numbers. But I think you've highlighted there a trend. Labor's marginally improved its primary vote, and the coalition primary vote effectively hasn't really shifted or dropped a point from the last election. That's probably been the way I would read it. It's reflected in a number of other polls. And I have to say, again, I've not seen an election with quite this much polling in the public domain. Every newspaper every couple of days seems to have its own. But most of them have shown that Newspoll trend in the last couple of weeks, which is Labor's primary vote strengthening and the Liberal primary vote dropping by a few points.
And the leaders seem to be, both of them are down. The net approval for Albo as Prime Minister is now -9, which is down 5. And Dutton is now -22, which is his worst ever score, down 3. So Labor might take some reassurance from the fact that Albo is less unpopular than the Liberal leader is unpopular, but neither of them are in positive territory. But as better Prime Minister, Albo is winning 52-36, which is a better number for him than he's used to getting. So biggest lead for Albo since May of 2024. I was interested to see that in July of 2022, he was +30, over 30 points ahead as better Prime Minister. And then that has steadily decayed over the year. So by January of this year, he was perhaps at his lowest ebb, but has now been recovering. So while the numbers don't look great, he has sort of turned a corner, it seems.
Yeah, the trend is your friend, I think. And
yes, that's right.
I've always thought, and I think this is even more acute now, because of the period of inflation we went through, which, as I said before, we've forgotten how angry that makes people. It's everyone every day at every time they go shopping. And we hadn't had it for 30 years. And I've always thought polling between elections is very much the ideal versus what you've got. Whereas an election turns to a very constrained choice. It's option A or option B. It doesn't matter if you don't like option A or option B. You have to choose one of them, and we make you turn up and at least collect a ballot paper, if not actually vote. And I do think that changes the frame of it. Now, it's fair to say, I think, that the government's recovery started earlier than the campaign, and the numbers you outlined pointed to that. But I do think the campaign itself and the fact that, they had a better first week of the start of the campaign, for those that engaged with it, for those that were turning their minds to it in the first couple of weeks, the Labor Party had a better start. We've now got a situation where in the last couple of weeks, the late deciders who can decide close elections and who can break one way or the other, and the polling doesn't always capture it. I think it's important to mention to people that polling has got a lot harder in recent years simply because it is so much harder to get in contact with the right numbers of people with the right demographic characteristics. So people have started to use different techniques. That was one of the reasons Some thought that the 2019 polls were a bit wrong and didn't predict the outcome correctly when Scott Morrison beat Bill Shorten. But as there's a lot more polling, it's become a lot harder to get representative samples, and therefore there's a bit more uncertainty involved. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next couple of weeks. I've always thought that the preferred Prime Minister rating isn't that important. John Howard was behind Paul Keating on the preferred Prime Minister rating on the day of the 1996 election. Didn't seem to hurt his chances. But the trend of both has been reflecting that I think the government has succeeded in defining the opposition leader in a way that they would prefer over the last 5, 6, 7 weeks, even the lead up to the campaign.
Yes, I agree with that. So Redbridge has done what it's calling a marginal seats poll and for News Corp, and its most recent poll was April 9 to 15. And this was a better result for Labor than News poll. It suggested a 2% swing to the ALP since their last poll at the beginning of April, which represents a 3.5% swing to the ALP since the last election. So Redbridge is really suggesting that in the marginal seats, perhaps the places where it matters most, the shift towards Labor is larger than it is elsewhere. Yeah. Do you think there's any chance that that's true?
Well, I think so. Historically, the outer suburban and the semi-regional seats, the classic marginal seats that decide elections, do swing more. They are historically more volatile. That's partly a product that you often have more types of households for whom the key issues in the campaign make a big difference, whether that be Medicare, inflation, interest rates.
And the parties try much harder in those places.
Absolutely. That's where the resources are directed. So it's not impossible that they are showing a bigger swing at all. If Redbridge is on the money, then Labor will probably get to a majority, because they've shown, I think, when you looked at that series of 4 polls they've done over those same 20 marginal seats, not just that particular end result last time, but also I think every poll has shown a slight improvement for Labor. Now, the coalition campaign insists that its internal work does not show that. This is one of those great mysteries of polling. They're not predictors. They are snapshots in time of 4 or 5 days ago. And with all the complexity of polling, if that one is correct, it could be like polls in other parts that just show the result earlier than others, or it could come back. And that doesn't mean it was wrong. It just means the campaign has changed. So, but again, I don't think the coalition would particularly like to see those numbers.
No, I think it was a bold poll by Redbridge. I mean, I'm obviously glad that this kind of work is being done. And if it proves to be true, then, it'll be a feather in Redbridge's cap.
And I think they're the only ones doing a sort of a targeted series of marginal seat polls that I can recall, which, is much more interesting, particularly with the low primary vote and the teals and the size of the crossbench, in essentially determining the result of the election, which is who becomes Prime Minister.
Well, I think that's a good segue for our next discussion, which is to do a bit of a survey over the battleground seats. And perhaps by way of introduction, I'll point out the fact that while we've just talked about polls and the kind of macro picture, the micro picture is everything in this election, because there's so many different seats, the geography of our big country, the different demographics, and the different parties clashing in different ways with one another mean that there are a lot of contests that are all very different and, frankly, all very unpredictable. So let's start with some of the wild cards. And I guess these are, starting with seats like Lyons and Lingiari. Let me perhaps just make predictions here, Scott, and you can contest them where you will. But Lyons in central Tasmania is a Labor-held seat, very marginal, always a tough contest, lots of small communities. My prediction here is that Labor will hold the seat, but I'm sure it will be a desperately tight contest.
Lyons has long been in Tasmania that seat that it's always just out of the Liberal Party's grasp, and there's always hope for it. And I think we all have those sorts of seats in various states. So without knowing it, I don't know the communities there that well, but knowing the history of it, I think anyone that makes a firm prediction on a seat like Lyons when the polls are like this is probably being a little bit more courageous than I would. You'll look for the first booths out of it. You'll look for the report of the pre-poll, and then that'll tell you reasonably early on whether there's a swing on. But it is so narrow that it could be one of those decided by postals again, 2 weeks later.
Lingiari in the Northern Territory, a seat that again is very marginal, perhaps a seat where turnout campaigns do need to exist because there are so many small Indigenous communities there that candidates need to campaign amongst and mobilise. I am fretful. I will suggest here that I think Labor is in danger of losing Lingiari. I think it will hold Solomon, which is essentially Darwin. Both will be close, but I think one of them may fall to the coalition, and that one I'm predicting is Lingiari.
Well, that would be a reversal of the history.
It would.
Where the regional Northern Territory seat has been the one that historically Labor has held, and the seat based around Darwin, having gone through various names over its existence, was the one that, when it fell more often than not to the coalition, but was always the key marginal contest. And so if that happened, that would be, reflect a serious turnaround in some voting constituencies with the high Indigenous and remote and regional distant voting content in Lingiari. The Electoral Commission puts in an extraordinary effort to get out to as many voters as possible. And, I would be surprised at that outcome, but that's more based on my sort of respect for history than predictions of the future.
Well, the recent history, the Northern Territory elections last, saw precisely that sort of strange turnaround you're talking about where, to be crude about it, the white vote has consolidated around the coalition and a larger portion of the Indigenous vote is voting coalition. Whether that was a moment in time or a trend, we will see. Turning to South Australia, there's been a lot of talk about South Australia, disproportionate in my universe. Here's my prediction. I think Labor's belief that it's close in Sturt will be proven to be a false dawn. I just think Sturt's a stubborn Tory electorate. I think Boothby will be a difficult one for Labor to hold. I rate the coalition candidate there, and I think that the coalition might end up with both of these seats. What do you think?
Well, we're at a historic low in South Australia, and so I do think part of it is that last time it was a bit like Melbourne in many ways. I find electorates in Adelaide that they tend to be similar to Melbourne in their behaviour. They were hit very hard by the swing against us in 2022. Sturt, you're quite right. It has come very, very close before. The former member, Christopher Pyne, it had gone down a bit like Kooyong and Higgins in Melbourne, what were once traditionally safe seats. Demographic change and boundary change had brought them down to very low single figures. But in this case, just like Christopher Pyne was a dogged local campaigner, James Stephens is a particularly dogged local campaigner, particularly sophisticated. And so I would tip him to hold, and that's partly because they've never been under the illusion that Sturt could not be lost. So it's been a seat that's been intentionally worked hard from day one. With Boothby, yes, the returning coalition candidate, Nicole Flint, did a great job holding it before retiring at one point and is now coming back. Boothby's a very tough seat for the coalition to win. I would say if the coalition can pull off Boothby, it's going to be a better night for the coalition than a lot of the current polls suggest. That's not to say it won't happen, but Boothby does tend to be a seat that will go with the government, not always, but if the coalition can take it off the Labor Party, with Peter Malinauskas being so popular in South Australia as he is, and a few issues in the state Liberal Party that have happened recently, then I think it'll be a very positive night. And if anyone can do it, it'll be Nicole.
Well, fingers and toes crossed that I'm wrong there, and Labor wins Sturt and Boothby. WA, Tagney and Bullwinkle seem to be the ones in the gun. I guess the good news for Labor is that the list is so small and that Labor's position in Western Australia seems to be really very strong. Bullwinkle seems to be the one that Labor is most concerned about. Tagney seems to be a toss-up. I guess these two seats will come under scrutiny on election night. What do you think?
Well, Bullwinkle is always more open because it being a new seat. So Western Australia had a redistribution and Victoria lost a seat. WA got a seat back. And so Bullwinkle is a new seat comprising a lot of outer suburbs of Perth. It is a rare three-cornered contest with the National Party and the Liberal Party running. And whether that assists, as it sometimes can, by maximising what you might call the Conservative and Liberal vote, or whether it doesn't help because there's preference leakage from what you'd expect the National Party to not overtake the Liberal Party, that'll be very interesting to watch. That said, in all of these areas at the last state election, the Liberal Party did not perform as it hoped it would, even with a relatively low threshold. I don't necessarily think Australians confuse state and federal politics at all. I think they make very conscious choices. But I would say Bullwinkle is the better of the two chances.
In Brisbane, Queensland, of course, is just a desperately poor state for my side of politics. Our presence there is small, and so it's going to be very depressing for me how few number of seats we're talking about now. But the ALP seems to be the favourite in the three-cornered contest in Brisbane, a seat presently held by the Greens, but has one-time Labor stronghold, fell to the Liberals, then fell to the Greens. Do you have any insights into who you think is going to win in Brisbane?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a favourite, to be honest, from what I've been speaking to. I spoke to a couple of former colleagues from Queensland just last week. It is a rare three-cornered contest, a bit like McNamara, the former Melbourne Ports, which is a Greens-Labor coalition contest, the LNP. Trevor Evans, the former member, returning, and he's, like Nicole, trying to return, and Tim Wilson and Goldstein in Victoria. It'll be interesting to see how they go. Returning members don't always do well, but I think there's more opportunity for them on the coalition side this time because for the reasons you mentioned with some of the Teal victories, there was antipathy towards the previous leadership, and that's not present. There didn't seem to be antipathy towards the individual members, especially those who didn't have a particularly high profile. What I did note, and I jumped online and checked, David, is that the LNP has put the Greens behind Labor in these three Brisbane seats of Griffith, Brisbane and Ryan that the Greens took last time. And Brisbane's probably the best example of a three-cornered contest, but it was pretty close in Griffith too, I understand. So if the Labor Party gets there, the odds are it could be on Liberal Party preferences.
Well, Adam Bant was, of course, elected as the member for Melbourne on Liberal Party preferences. And
not the second time, only the first time.
He's been able to live with that, Scott. And if he can live with that, I reckon the Labor Party can live with it too. What about Ryan? This is one that a lot of us have just said the Liberal Party's going to win this one back. It was an aberration.
I think Ryan was an aberration. I mean, the seats within Ryan, the state seats, had changed, had fallen to the Greens at a couple of elections. And parts of Ryan are very much like Kooyong. It's got the University of Queensland at one end and all the population and the ancillary parts of the university that spread out from there. And that's been one of the drivers in the change of demographics of Kooyong that enabled the Teals to get closer and win there. But the Liberal Party is very hopeful of Ryan, and I would suggest if the Liberal Party doesn't win Ryan back, like winning Boothby back would be a sign of a night going well. Not winning Ryan back early on would be a sign that it's not going to go as well.
Now, there are three regional contests that I don't feel like have got really much coverage at all, but I think they're important because they could really put a spanner in the coalition's wheel on election night if they go poorly. And these are Cowper, Calare and Wannon, where in all three of these sort of largely rural seats, we've got coalition candidates fighting with independents, country independents. One of those is a former coalition MP, G. Another one, Alex Dyson in Wannon, is a radio personality who's definitely not a Teal because all of his material is orange. Do you think these three contests are a threat to the coalition, or are you going to see these independents off?
Well, I wouldn't say, every election's, I would never say to a member of the House of Reps or a candidate that every election isn't a threat in one way. I mean, that's the purpose of it. But look, in Wannon, I'm very confident that Dan Tehan will hold the seat of Wannon. Again, the Liberal vote in Victoria was uniquely, in my view, suppressed last time. And it's not just that there's an unpopular state government, although that helps. It's not just that there's been a change in leadership, and it's not just that people have had a difficult economic 3 years. There's a whole range of other factors that means the primary vote, in my view, for someone like Dan Tehan will come back to a more historic level and simply ensure that he can hold the seat against, the well-resourced campaign of Alex Dyson. In Calare, it's one of those situations where you have a National Party MP who has defected from the party or stood aside from the party and decided to run as an independent. And in New South Wales, they have a pretty good track record of holding a seat, whether it be Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott, who came from state parliament. These areas of New South Wales do have a history of independence. And as I understand, the how to vote cards do strongly favour G, including from other candidates. So I wouldn't make a prediction. It's not a community I know particularly well, but it's not the situation that the National Party would want to be in right now.
The Hunter Valley and the central coast of New South Wales is always an interesting contest because this is one sort of patch of seats where energy policy and the future of coal manages to become a frontline issue every time. I'm thinking this time it might be a little duller than usual in the sense that Meryl Swanson, the Labor MP for Patterson, has a 3.3% margin. Gordon Reid in Robertson, a 2.2% margin. Both of these are key targets for the coalition, but I'm feeling like Labor's getting quietly confident about its prospects here. Richmond is a three-cornered contest, coalition, Labor and Greens. Labor holds the seat at present. I think you'd have to say Labor is the favourite, but three-cornered contests are intrinsically unpredictable. Do you think anything seismic's going to happen on the Central Coast or in Richmond?
Well, Robertson, of course, I think is now as close as we have to a national bellwether, having gone with government since 1983. Since my colleague here at the University of Canberra, Mike Kelly, broke the running streak of Eden Monero when he held it when the Liberal Party was in office. So it's that famous seat that everyone looks for. It's got the former member Lucy Wicks running for re-election, who was quite popular there. Look, I don't think a 2% margin is what it was 10 years ago and definitely not 20 years ago. I mean, you have sometimes as many people as that moving in and out of an electorate in a given 3-year period.
Very true.
So, and there has been a slight impact of the redistribution change there as well. Robertson is one of those ones that the Liberal Party and the coalition will look to see if there's movement early on in the count on election night. And again, you look for these seats because it's not just because they've historically moved in one direction, but they demographically are similar to the other seats you need to win. And Robertson will be one that both sides are looking to, I think, David, to say if there's movement there either direction, it's not a guarantee that's the direction the election's going to go, but it's a pretty good predictor early on in the evening.
A good one to keep an eye on over the course of the night. Sydney itself, how do you feel about the coalition holding Bradfield? And do you think the coalition can make any gains at the expense of the Teals in Sydney?
So you've had the seat of North Sydney abolished, so, because New South Wales lost a seat, so they're already down one Teal, so to speak. I don't think many people are optimistic about the coalition's chances in Wentworth. Allegra Spender seems to have a particularly high profile, and they have lots of workers on their booths. And Bradfield is a challenge. The Teal candidate there, who has essentially run a shadow member's office for the last 3 years, hasn't just come in the last few weeks. I was familiar with our candidate Giselle there, and it's like all the other Teal seats, it is a tight contest. And the interesting thing, in my view, as a former Liberal MP from the other side of town in Melbourne, from the western suburbs, is one of the things these Teal seats are doing is ensuring Liberal resources are kept in local communities more. And we used to assist campaigns in marginal seats from the extra resources we had available in Kooyong or Higgins. And the same thing's happening in Sydney. So it's not just a close seat in Bradfield, and it will be a close seat. It also means it's tying up Liberal resources there that previously were not tied up in Bradfield.
And of course, that's absolutely true for Labor as well. I remember as a young man, the Labor Federal Electoral Assembly of Melbourne was a political powerhouse that could sponsor campaigns elsewhere, and it's been a green seat for, the last 15 years or so.
That's where I voted until recently.
Right. So exactly the same phenomena is affecting Labor. Gilmore, Parramatta, Reid all seem to be slipping out of the coalition's target zone. Do you have any reason to think that the coalition can be optimistic there?
I'd always be more optimistic about Gilmore. I mean, it was literally 307, a few hundred votes last time. So again, more people have moved in and out of that electorate than is the margin. And we do have a returning candidate for whom there was strong local support and probably got it closer last time than anyone else would have got it. I think Andrew Constance, after his performance as a minister, particularly during the bushfires, that cost the federal government so much when he was a state minister, he managed to almost win a seat at a really tough election for the Liberal Party.
He did.
So I would still, if I had to put money on us, I'd put money on, I'm not a betting man, I'd back Andrew Constance. Parramatta's been a hard seat for the Liberal Party for a long, long time. We held it, then we didn't hold it quite a few times in the Howard era and the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison era. But it's always managed to stick with Labor a little bit more than some of the other seats around it, like Reid, which Craig Laundy held for quite a few terms. So you've got a high-profile candidate there in Andrew Charlton, who comes from a background working for Kevin Rudd. Katie Mullins is running a very strong campaign. But Parramatta, again, is one of those seats that's always proved tougher, and I'm not naturally an optimist, but if Parramatta was to fall to the Liberals, I think, David, I'd be having a better night than you.
I think that's true. Of course, these are the sorts of places that were Howard's battlers, isn't it?
Although we lost it in 2004, I think, at a very strong election. Yeah.
Sure. I think it's been drifting back to Labor pretty consistently for some time.
Ever imagine a future where you're the one creating the podcast? With a Master of Communication from the University of Canberra, you can. Study 100% online and gain the skills to lead in the communication field. Find out more at canberra.edu.au.
So let's turn to the jewel in the Liberal Party's crown, the state of Victoria, and some interesting contests here in my home state. Monash, I think, is an interesting one. Here we've got Russell Broadbent, long-time, popular, very likeable chap in the parliament who lost his Liberal Party pre-selection and is now running as an independent. I know has essentially garnered all of the non-coalition parties' support in his effort to remain the member for Monash. Do you think Monash is in danger for the coalition?
Look, it's disappointing. I know Russell, but also know particularly very well Mary Aldred, who was a long-time Russell supporter and won Liberal Party pre-selection. I always find it disappointing when people run against the party they ran for pre-selection for and weren't successful.
Yes, I agree with you about that.
But politics is a game of brutal numbers, and he does seem to have garnered the preferences.
Loyalty still has a place in politics, I'd like to believe.
Me too. But Mary is the ideal candidate the Liberal Party's been seeking. She's had a career in business in the community and government sector. And it is disappointing that Russell did not support her in seeking to take over, because Russell's had a pretty good run. He's actually, I think, holds a record for the only person who has lost a seat in the House of Representatives and then been re-elected 3 times, having done that, in the 90s and then the 2000s as well. So it is going to be close.
Yeah, he beat a friend of mine, Christian Zara, for what was then Macmillan.
Yes, I think in 2004, and that was his 3rd comeback. So I do think this seat's going to be closer than it seems on paper, precisely because you have a high name ID outgoing local member who's managed to corral support of local independents, and obviously, the Labor Party will throw their preferences to the non-Liberal.
Yes. Kooyong and Goldstein. I mean, we've talked about Kooyong, where the margin is tight, getting a lot of coverage. It seems like every sign that's torn down in that electorate, it's got a camera watching it. Do you think...
I had a friend, actually, that had their sign attacked, and they put up a letter saying, dear so-and-so, please leave the sign here. And then the letter got attacked.
And then Amelia Hamer got into a little bit of strife describing herself as a renter, and when, of course, she has some investment properties. But just this weekend, I was talking to a constituent in Kooyong who was adamant, she is a renter. She is renting. And I was like, well, sure, but maybe renters aren't usually also property owners. But I wonder if she's going to shrug that embarrassment off. Do you think she can win Kooyong back?
I do.
Can she be the next comp from Kooyong?
I do think Kooyong's a classic case where there's not many swinging voters. There's been so much money poured into elections for Kooyong now, both particularly last time with Josh Frydenberg and Monique Ryan, and so much national focus on it, to the exclusion of all other Teal seats, you'd probably say. It's got more coverage.
Yeah. Goldstein's got a little bit, but I agree with you. Kooyong's the one they're watching.
But living here in Canberra, it's getting much more coverage than any other seat. You're in Melbourne, you might see Goldstein as well. I do think this is going to be one to watch very closely, watch for the pre-polls to see if there's a change from what happened last time, because that being so much of the vote, if there's a change in the pre-polls from last time, I think that'll be a very good lead indicator. This is an electorate that doesn't have as many late decideds, or what some people might call less engaged voters, than other places, partly because of the money, partly because of its demographics. But I do think, like Goldstein, which does have a slightly higher margin than Kooyong, the Liberals are back in the hunt, again partly because we're coming off that historic low in a party primary vote where there was hostility, and I don't think that's there anymore.
Well, and of course, Amelia Hamer is a woman, to state the obvious, and I wonder if that then mitigates some of the perceived criticisms of the Liberal Party in these sorts of communities. That's not the case, of course, in Goldstein, where the former Liberal member is running again. Do you think, Tim, has got a chance in Goldstein. The polls seem to suggest that he does.
Well, Goldstein surprised me more last time than Kooyong, if I've got to say. It doesn't have the same demographic characteristics. While it did move to, obviously, the Teal and Zoe Daniel, it did surprise me more. I thought it was less vulnerable because of the suburbs that make it up. It doesn't have a university smack bang in the middle of it with the demographic elements that brings that tend to not be as supportive of the Liberal Party. So if somewhere swings back because there's not that hostility towards the leadership or the party to the same degree, I think Goldstein is one that would probably move a bit more like Wannon than Kooyong.
Yeah, I thought it was a mistake by the Liberal Party to run Tim again, but in a few weeks' time, I might be proven wrong about that prediction.
Well, the difference is, you get to choose candidates. In the Liberal Party, I think Tim had about 300 people voting. So it's sort of, again, going back to that earlier discussion, the differences between the parties, where the Liberal Party lacks the same mechanisms to choose a candidate, even where, for example, as you outlined once, we clearly needed more women. We don't have the capacity to impose choices in the same way the Labor Party does.
Yeah, I thought the Teal's victory in Goldstein had something of the character of an uprising against Tim, and so to leave him, perhaps I'm wrong about that, but that's how it looked to me. And so for that reason, I thought running him again was a courageous decision, Minister. Chisholm and Aston in the eastern suburbs, you might say these are must-wins for the coalition, aren't they?
Well, you would really hope that we can take Aston back. It fell in that period of unique popularity and short unique popularity to the Labor Party at the start of its term when Alan Tudge left the parliament. And Chisholm's close. It's a very new seat because of the redistribution and the abolition of Higgins. With Katie Allen, the former member for Higgins, high profile, substantial professional career. Yeah, the Liberal Party would be looking for those to be coming into the blue column relatively early on in the evening if the night's going to be a good one.
McEwen and Hawke, by contrast, are sort of on the western and northern parts of the city, normally good Labor territory, but outer suburbs under threat now. Labor's been anxious about both of these seats. These are the kinds of outer suburban seats Dutton was targeting. Do you think he can have a good showing here? This is where I guess you're hoping that the unpopularity of the state government counts for something. I saw a billboard ad which sort of highlighted the fact that it pictured Albo with the Victorian Premier, Jacinta Allen. Can you risk both? I thought that was a very interesting effort by the Liberal Party to try and get their candidates over the line in these traditional Labor places.
Well, I do remember the 2018 state election where I think Labor Party did exactly the same, where they put Matthew Guy between Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton on all their billboards. So, let they who were innocent cast the first stone in this regard, David.
I always bow my head to good political advertising.
But this is where the demographic change in voting patterns is going to first start to be seen. Now, the current seat in McEwen is very, very different to the seat held by Fran Bailey many years ago. It's in a different part of Melbourne. Yes. It's much more peri-urban, as the term we would use, than it was regional, which Fran Bailey had. And the seat of Hawke is effectively a newish seat that, 15 years ago was market gardens with a few towns.
Very true.
So, these are rapidly developing parts of Melbourne in what is the fastest growing city in the country, in Melbourne. And I know the Liberal Party is optimistic about these outer suburbs. Whether or not they can take them in one election or it becomes part of a longer term trend that you might need to build up over 2 or 3 elections, I think that we'll see that on the night. More optimism about McEwen, partly because of the suburbs it's in, partly because they are places the Liberal Party's previously held, than Hawke, which is more new territory for the Liberal Party. But, I've just seen this morning, for example, some photos of pre-poll booths, and there's more Liberal Party activity out there than I think we've ever seen.
Yes. McNamara, the old Melbourne Ports, a seat where a significant portion of Victoria's Jewish community resides, and for a long time now, a toughly fought three-cornered contest between Liberal, Labor and the Greens. And again, that's exactly the contest. Interestingly enough, on this occasion, Josh Burns, the Labor candidate, seems to have got away with his request that the Labor Party issue a open ticket in terms of its preferences. So the Labor Party is not preferencing Green, but letting voters decide how they preference. Do you think that's going to matter?
Well, I've always been a little bit perplexed by the media's talking of parties directing preferences. Now, in the Senate, that was once true, but in the House of Representatives, it was never true. I mean, there's a recommendation on a how to vote card. You didn't have to take it. You didn't have to follow it. So the idea of directing preferences, I've always thought the nomenclature there is a bit of an issue. It is fascinating here that I think this will be the only seat in the country where the Labor Party does not preference the Greens above the coalition.
I think that's true.
I think that will reflect the vulnerability of the Labor Party in this seat. I don't think the alternative was tenable, given that this seat has seen some of the most horrid examples of anti-Semitism I think we've ever seen in my lifetime in Australia.
Yes.
And it will be a three-cornered contest.
The white-hot anger in the Jewish community towards the Greens,
Yep.
as you say, meant it was completely impossible for Josh to do anything else.
And I don't think that white-hot anger is unfounded. But this has long been a seat, when it was called Melbourne Ports, the Liberal Party used to think it could always get close to, and sometimes it got it down to 3 or 4%. It's been changed a little bit because of the redistribution in Victoria and the abolition of the seat of Higgins. So I think this time there is the best prospect ever for the coalition to take it when you add all those factors, the local factors, plus the fact that the Liberal Party is expecting to receive a swing in Victoria off its historic low and off a particularly unpopular state government. But again, I only qualify that by saying, comparing it to 1990, I think in 1990 when the Liberal Party won 9 seats in Victoria, there was hostility to both the federal Labor government and the state Labor government because of higher interest rates, the recession, unemployment and the like. This time, there is definitely hostility to the state government. I'm not convinced there's the same hostility to the federal government as I saw in 1990 in Victoria.
And I don't think the hostility towards the state government is the same order of magnitude that was being experienced by Kane in the dying days of his government. I mean, those were scarring moments for Victorian Labor veterans like myself. That government was in a whole lot more trouble than the Labor state government is here at present. So let's finish our national survey with the seat of Wills. Again, a seat that's got a fair bit of coverage. The Labor candidate Khalil is being challenged by Samantha Ratnam of the Greens. She's a former state leader of the Greens, a local councillor in this neck of the woods. This neck of the woods is where she's best known. She gave Peter Khalil a tough run for this seat in 2016, and now she's coming up for the rematch. Everyone says that her chances are better this time round because of anger inside Australia's Islamic community towards the government over its handling of Gaza and the rise of this Muslim Voice, a political organisation that is going to take or seek to mobilise Australians of Islamic faith and preference the Greens. Do you think this cunning conspiracy will work?
Well, this is not a three-cornered contest, David. I don't think the Liberal Party is going to trouble the scorer much here. No. And Liberal Party preferences will, in my view, reliably flow to the Labor Party. I mean, whole swathe of North Carlton, where I used to live, has been moved into Wills. That's not good for Peter Khalil. That is very green territory. But it's essentially a contest of North versus South, isn't it, in this electorate? You know, you go up north of Bell Street, you have areas like Hadfield, still strong traditional Labor areas, versus down to South, Brunswick East, North Carlton, which really are, Greens heartland these days. So I think...
But I think something like 1 in 5 voters is Islamic,
yep,
of Islamic faith. And so that is that north-south divide that you might expect undermined from the Labor perspective by a swathe of traditional Labor voters of Islamic faith expressing their frustration with the federal Labor government's lack of support in their view for Gaza by preferencing Green.
And I think that combined with what various polls have identified and we discussed earlier with respect to McEwen and Hawke, the old Labor coalition of voters that it could rely on is not as reliable as it once was to deliver, very strong primary booths. So everyone will be watching Wills because it'll be a real barometer into how the Greens are going. Not just, there's 2 questions for them. Can they hold their seats in Brisbane and can they expand their reach in Melbourne? They're the 2 questions, I think. And if the Greens go backwards, it'll be yet another example of how they talk about optimistic outcomes, but they don't deliver them. But if they win Wills, that will be a big victory for them, because once they win, not always, but they historically do hold on to most of the seats they win.
So as we've seen from that survey of the battleground seats, there's a lot of different shapes and contours going on in this campaign, a lot of detail, a lot of moving parts. And so notwithstanding what the macro polls tell us, each of these contests is going to make all of the difference as to whether the Labor Party can form a majority government, whether we have a minority government, whether Dutton can have the breakthrough. I guess we'll find out more in our next exciting episode. Scott, thank you very much.
See you next week, David.
David and Scott are following the campaign over coming weeks and will return weekly with further informed analysis and opinion right up to Election Day on the 3rd of May. So save this podcast to your favourites and be sure to join Across the Aisle again next week, brought to you by the University of Canberra with production by the Faculty of Arts and Design.